Hey guys, welcome to Psychology with Rit video lessons. We're going to get started here. I like doing these, it frees up some class time. It also gives you the opportunity to go back and either use this as a review or your first introduction to the lesson. Maybe you missed the day. Hopefully, these work out for you. Hopefully, you enjoy them. Try to keep them down to about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the topics. This one will probably be a little bit longer because we're diving into lesson 1.1, the history of psychology. So this is our first. So where are we going to start? Well, let's start in the beginning, right? When we first look at the psychology, we want to look at it from a philosophical standpoint, right? Psychology has not been around that long, but the idea of understanding human knowledge has been, right? Socrates and Plato believed that knowledge was born within us, and they utilize the idea of what we call introspection, examining one's own thoughts and feelings. This has been around quite a long time. In fact, we also could talk about Aristotle, right? Knowledge grows from the experience and is stored in our memories. A part of the problem of this is it's not very scientific. What your interpretation of knowledge may be would be different than mine, or my thoughts and feelings could possibly be different. So this is really still in the philosophical thing, not quite psychology. But along comes Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon contributes the idea of the scientific method. And all of you guys have done science fair or in your various science classes ran experiments. You have to follow the scientific method, right? On a hypothesis, a thesis, uh, observations, measurements, actual controls of the experiments, and then interpretation. Right? Modern psychology relies on this method. So, when do we actually talk about psychology? Well, modern psychology, or at least what we think of as psychology, was born in the 1879s, the late 19th century. Uh, Starts with a gentleman named William Wundt, a German philosopher at the University of Leipzig. And he actually, his goal is to apply the experimental methods of natural science to philosophical problems. He wants to combine introspection, that looking within, with actual lab observations. He doesn't think that you can just haphazardly, introspectively look at your feelings and really understand them or apply them outside of yourself, right? So, along with another gentleman named Edward Titchener, he develops the school of structuralism, or what becomes structuralism, right? Wundt and his students believed that you could understand the structure of the mind through that introspection, close examination of one's own conscious experience. And their work involved activities trying to categorize both the objective sensations and the subjective feelings. So our conscious experience is actually broken into different parts, right? And it's the mind's function. The mind functions to combine these two ideas. Oops. Right? And so, for example, we've all eaten or we've all seen an apple, right? And we can objectively describe that apple, how it tastes, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like. Those are objective sensations. But we all would have our own potential subjective feelings about that. Might bring back a memory of how great it tastes, or that you don't like that. That you had to eat apples as a fruit snack instead of candy. Those types of things are subjective feelings. All right, that brings us to a couple new schools that I want to throw out there. We're not going to talk about the Gestalt a lot, but Gestalt psychology is based on the idea that perceptions are more than the sums of their parts. In other words, consciousness can best be understood by observing it as a total experience rather than breaking it down. If you remember, structuralism's breaking it down to the observable, objective portions and the subjective sections. Gestalt says, nah, let's look at it all as a big picture. If you are looking at this photo here to the left as a Gestalt, you may see a Dalmatian. Maybe you should pause it, see the front hind quarter right here, the head. It's kind of walking away from you. If you're looking at these photos, right, you probably see a circle and a square. Really, it's just dotted lines. The whole becomes greater than the sum. Our mind fills in these blanks. So we don't want to just break it down too much, according to Gestalt. Along with that, this looks a lot like a moving photo, right? We see this. This appears to be a horse running, where it is really just a series of photos. That brings us to the next school of functionalism, right? And it's an important early one. American psychologist William James begins the study and teaching psychology in Harvard, and James and his students build upon Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection, right? That consciousness actually works to help people adapt to their environment. It serves a function, right? Darwin, brown beetles in a brown environment last longer, survive more than green beetles, right? And because the green beetles are easier to spot. And over time, populations of brown beetles will increase. Well, James borrows this idea and applies it to human psychological characteristics, and that's what he calls functionalism, right? It focuses on the understanding the purpose of consciousness and these mental processes, how these mental processes help us survive and adapt. William James is best known for his first modern book of psychology, written in the 1890s, called The Principles of Psychology. All right, we're going to move into fairly quickly a couple of the more modern schools, but kind of big schools that are important um, in this traveling of history. The next lesson, we dive way more into more schools of thought, but let's start with psychoanalysis, right? Uh, Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud is considered the father of psychoanalysis. It's often called Freudian psychology, psychoanalytic psychology. It focuses on the role of the unconscious in shaping our behavior, the things that we aren't necessarily conscious about, right? He develops explanations of behavior that focus on things like forgotten childhood experiences and unconscious desires. Freud believes many patients exhibited psychological symptoms due to painful child experiences or repressed sexual desires. He develops these treatment approaches intended to bring the unconscious material into conscious awareness. Think of repressed dreams. He might do a dream analysis or similar techniques to that, right? Through the 1960s, psychoanalytic approaches were the primary form of things like talk therapy. Now, he also inspired other psychologists like Carl Jung, Eric Erikson, Alfred Adler, Karen Horney. We're going to talk about those. Each of them shared Freud's belief about the importance of early childhood experiences, but they felt Freud overemphasized sex and had an overly negative view of human nature. They begin to explore other motivators, such as the drive to achieve, building close relationships, right? Now, one of the big problems with Freud was that his ideas were not falsifiable. In other words, he couldn't really be tested, they weren't scientific, right? It's not possible to test whether a person's behavior is being influenced by some undetectable, unconscious desire. So as psychology develops, it became more scientific. Later schools of thought shifted away from this perspective towards more testable hypothesis, right? And so Freud, you see his things all the time. Freud action figures, bobbleheads. He always has a thing about your relationship with your mother in analysis of. All right, so what I want you to do now in this last little school that we're going to talk about is imagine a mouse, and that mouse is working its way through a maze to try to find cheese. And so, as that mouse enters the maze, he goes down and he comes to a spot where he needs to make a decision. Do I turn left or do I turn right? And he realizes that every time he's gotten to this point and he's turned right, he's gotten cheese. Therefore, when he gets to this point, he makes that decision of let's move to the right. Let's go to the right so that he knows he can get that cheese, and everybody wants to get that cheese. All right, that's going to bring us to one last school, and that's behaviorism, founded by John B. Watson. Remember, the B could be for behavioralism, right? Or behavioralist. He believed it was unscientific to try to use behavior as a way to understand the unconscious. Instead, he just thought psychologists should base psychology on what they can observe. He recognized Freud's unconscious mind. He believed in that, but it was unobservable, and therefore he'd prevent psychology from being a science. So, really, up until the 1920s here, psychology was defined as the science of mental life. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, Watson believed he wanted to redefine it as the scientific study of observable behavior. Right? He said you cannot observe a sensation or a feeling or a thought, but you can observe and record people's behavior as they respond to different situations. This also leads to a gentleman named B.F. Skinner, and he introduces this concept of reinforcement to control and maintain behavior. So we start getting into educational psychology, emphasizing things like learning, things like conditioning or reinforcement, right? He Think about it this way: we train animals, right? We can train animals to do tricks based on reinforcement. If any of you guys have a dog, you've probably taught it to do a few things, right? um, Animals can be taught complex behaviors, right? And so really, when we're looking at that, we're putting BF Skinner's theories into action. All right, guys, that's Psychology 101 or Lesson 1.1, the history. The next step will probably be moving into the various schools of thought, then into the subfields and the different roles that we can play. Hope you enjoyed this. Look forward to putting some more out. This one's probably a little rough. It is the first cut, but good luck. I'll see you in class.